Welcome, everyone, to the B2B Marketing Perspectives podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And when I tell you you're going to get a very unique perspective today, I am not kidding. We have on Aaron Ballew from Split. Aaron is the CMO of Split. And we're going to talk about a subject matter that is all about abandoning what we as marketers, as CMOs, hold dear. And when I say that you're going to get a really interesting perspective, Aaron is actually a PhD in electrical engineering and made the transition over to marketing, which is not the typical career path. But Aaron has a way of thinking about things, and we're going to talk about a concept of forced learning. We're going to talk about all kinds of things that Aaron has learned recently and has a very, very interesting perspective on. So there's a good buildup for you, Aaron. Maybe give us just a little bit of more of a background insight into who you are and how you got to where you are here today before we kind of get into the meat of the subject.
Okay, well, thanks for having me, Steve. It's nice to talk with you. I was an engineer by trade. I was going down a fairly academic path potentially, and I loved math. I was pretty good at it, and sometimes you get into a thing that you're good at, and there's certain reinforcing factors in your life that just keep you going down that path. But when you're a young person, there's so many different possible paths you could have gone down. So, and I still love math and engineering and science, but there were so many other things that also it kind of inspired my mind. And so as I went through this engineering career, I also I got into a professional engineering role, and actually a sales engineering role eventually, which was really interesting because it exposed me to the idea of go-to-market and selling and interact. And I really enjoyed just interacting with people and seeing all the different projects out there, like behind the scenes. And so that's long story that we can talk about sometime, but I got an opportunity to go into technical marketing at one point, to be the engineer who likes to talk to people and sort of translate all the techie stuff and the capabilities into something that, makes sense and means something and is understandable and valuable to people who sometimes we're also engineers, but sometimes we're not. And that turned into, my new profession, which I've run with ever since.
Well, fantastic. And that explains a lot in terms of, you were translating something very technical and making it very understandable. And what we're going to talk about here today is something that is a new way to think about what we've always done. And we've all heard about the marketing playbook and everything, right? Tell us a little bit, because I think in this day and age, right, a lot of us in our marketing departments, we're restricting, right? Our budgets are shrinking. We're trying to do more with less, get more efficient. But within that process, you had some pretty big discoveries. Maybe tell us just a little bit, give us the kind of the overall, the 1,000-foot level, and then let's dive down deep into it. But tell us what happened at, kind of at the top end of the story here, and what you learned.
Yeah, what's happened is what's happened to, hundreds and hundreds of other, I'll just say companies, but in my world, I'll call them tech companies, these high growth tech companies, maybe startups, late stage startups, all powering through to some exit or IPO, investing heavily towards, heavy growth. And the world has changed for us. And the mandate is not just grow at all costs. You all can finish my sentence at this point. It's to shift towards a path to profitability. It's towards efficiency. It's towards lowering your CAC and your kind of cost structure. It's a dynamic that is very directly linked back to kind of the availability of cash, the cost of cash, and all that economy stuff that we're reading about every day. So we're part of that, and these massive shifts in our industry, our kind of microeconomy, there's a lot of correlation, there's a lot of correlatedness or synchronization in when this all happens, because many of us share investors through our boards, some of us are PE backed or whatever, but we're all part of these portfolios. And when this, good advice comes down from people who are in the know and seeing the patterns emerging. You often see them synchronize. So, nobody's throwing out just blanket statements, but the right answer for one may often be the right answer for another when you have a similar profile. And so we're all in this massive shift to becoming highly, highly efficient. It's really a significant change, and it changes the kind of business that you're running. And it removes a lot of the room for certain patterns, maybe getting away with certain norms and standards and frameworks, things that everyone has been conditioned to deploy, that we've learned is best practice. We've learned from there was a blog post or there was a conference talk about it, and this is what you're supposed to do. And we all learned that, and we know that all our peers are out there doing that. And what comes from it is a certain media mix. You have certain different functions within your organization. Everyone does these things because you're supposed to, and you've got the money for it. And the cost or the risk of not doing those things seems like a fairly high opportunity cost. And why wouldn't you do them? Because you have the money for it. So you want to be on standard, right? You want to be doing best practice, industry standard.
Nobody's whole second guess you, right? Because they're standard. They're
that's what you're supposed to do. That's why they hired you. And those things are helpful. They're helpful, especially when you're learning, but they're really helpful to give you some confidence that these hard decisions you're making are likely to be the right ones. But that's not what is going. You don't have that room right now. Right now the shift is so extreme, much more so than a normal shift, where it's cutting deeply into your ability to just do things on faith or on pattern or because of tradition, because those are the norms. Now you have the opportunity to find out something that in past times it might not have been wise to run that test. You would never have run that test. You would never have pulled out a certain thing from your plan, because why would you? It's just what everyone does. And if you don't, then all the good things that you believe come from it won't. What if they don't come? But now you're in the place where you kind of have to test it. So this is a time to learn what really was the impact.
So could you give us a real world example of one of these things that was part of the playbook, right? That had to get taken out, and what the learning from that was, because it's this idea of I call it forced experimentation, right?
Yeah.
You're experimenting with a significant part of the playbook that you never would have before. The risk would have been too high. Why would you do it? Nobody's asking you to do it, but you're forced to do it.
Yeah.
What happens when you have a personal experience in this?
Yeah, definitely. There are a couple of examples. I'll pick on the examples where I think all the marketers, in the room know, like we know, we've lived it, where there's a certain amount of attribution and demonstration of ROI through sourced pipeline or influenced or whatever that you can do, but the cost relative to that is not quite enough to really make you feel great about it. So you fill in the rest with the theory and the framework and the best practice, even though you can't. It's not going to be easy to measure those things. It's not going to be easy to prove those things to your CFO, who's really looking for strong evidence. So you kind of make an appeal to standards, practices, and the very plausible, the very sensible theory of how the machinations must work behind the scenes, even though it's very difficult for us to observe those, to measure them. So for example, expensive trade show sponsorships are one, where you scan badges at the booth, you generate leads and pipeline and some ROI, but they're also very expensive, these shows. And so to bridge the remainder of that gap in the story, you appeal to, again, very plausibly, but you need to be there and be seen. If you're not there, your absence will be noticed, and people will walk by and see you. They may not scan or become an opportunity right then, but it's a multi-touch journey, right? They'll then check you out in some other forum. They'll see, and then there'll be some recall, like they'll see your social post and remember you because they saw you at the trade show, and then they'll come inbound, and that value is material, very hard to quantify, very hard to prove, but it's very compelling, it's convincing, and it helps to justify those hard ones. Some things are easy, some things are hard, and that's one of the harder ones. in my case, that was one that I had to wrestle with. Another was, programmatic display advertising, for example. You get some click-throughs, you get some leads, you run a lead generation oriented version, you run an awareness oriented version. We all know how it works. You build your audience pools, you experiment, with broader or narrower, do all those things, of course. But the actual click-throughs, even through the lead gen, they're never quite what you hoped they would be. And when they do click through and they convert to a lead, those aren't usually the ones converting at a real high rate that are feeding the kind of sales pipeline. They're part of the mix. But you fill in the rest of the story with, but awareness, they may not click, but they'll see it. And then they'll come inbound and it'll actually show up not only in, like, say, paid search, it might show up in organic search, right? It'll look like organic search, like they just showed up because they didn't click. You might call it a view through conversion if for some reason you're able to tell that they were the one that you served it, or maybe they clicked but didn't convert. All the things that are done to try to create the breadcrumb trail. But you appeal to, there's value there though, even though it's not the main thing, the leads, there's still that value there. Well, that makes sense. People have to be aware, else why would they come to your website? So, I was confronted with this question. Look, I've got to cut some funding in various places. How much, I already know the obvious. I know what directly comes through programmatic display. I already know what comes through retargeting. I already know what comes through the event trade shows. I know that part. What if I were theoretically to remove that? What's the remaining incremental value that was coming through those unmeasurables, right? Coming through inbound, coming through organic search. And we tried, it was very hard to kind of infer what it would be, but we kind of roughly estimated it was about 10% for us.
So 10% was when you took those away, there was a detrimental 10% to another area of the business.
Yeah. Would it hurt my inbound? Would it hurt organic search, right? And those kind of, contact us and demo request conversions, that kind of stuff. So we roughly estimated 10.
Unless you actually just remove this.
Yeah.
Right?
You wouldn't know unless you were forced to remove it, because you would never actually run that test. You would never just pull it out of your mix. You would, because you didn't have to. I mean, it's a compelling enough argument. But now we're in this situation where you really are forced to make some really hard decisions. So it's like, in a way, you have a freedom to try. And we found out it wasn't 10%. It was more like 15%. It was more than we expected. So I actually saw an initial dip in organic inbound, but it was good to know what it actually was.
Right.
And then build back up from there.
Hypothesizing. Right.
Yeah. Instead of just going off of the belief and the patterns. And the consequence of it is it doesn't change the fact that I love being at a trade show. I love working a booth, and for the right ones, maybe we can do that. I love the creative on ads and all. That doesn't mean I don't believe in those things to some extent, but by getting a really quantifiable and reality-based view of the contribution, like the net, the kind of marginal contribution, now my CAC, my marketing CAC, has come down dramatically. Like I'm able to grow at not just a slightly, like a 15% more efficient, but like a 40% more efficient kind of order of magnitude. It's really challenged us to find some things, some insight that we would have been kind of afraid to find, afraid to seek.
Explain this 40% efficiency, right? So you had talked about, like, when you took events away, but then you became more discerning on when you start adding that back in, because it was part of the playbook. There's kind of maybe a bigger world of events that you were being a part of that you weren't, as discriminating on in terms of should we be there or not. So as you're adding elements back in, as they were taken out and you're adding back in, explain how you're achieving this efficiency. Kind of like make the connection a little bit more for us, if you could.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it's not all just based on like, show me the data, sort of after the fact. We actually went to first principles, like deep into first principles, which is segmentation, targeting, positioning, like who really is our target? we were going to a calendar of events, and this discussion is not intended to like particularly be picking on events. Again, I love events, I love supporting events, but it's just an example. And we were going and following the kind of event calendar that we knew our competitors were at. It's like, well, you have to be there, that's where we are, right? And there were some that we believed was kind of our core audience. There were some that we thought, these are important, potentially influencers, it's like close enough, there's overlap there, we'll see a lot of our people there, and then maybe there's more. Now when you go back to first principles, this is a thing where actually everyone outside of marketing expects that you are doing this, right? They expect that you have this on lock. But if we're honest with ourselves, and I know a lot of marketing leaders and behind the scenes, like sometimes there are certain patterns in place that it would actually, even if there's just not a lot of realistic likelihood that you're going to be able to not renew with event X because it's just something people believe in so much. It's like, well, you got to be there. So what's the point? But when we go down to first principles and we realize, like, wait a second, let's be really, really honest and precise with ourselves. Who cares about this? And what do they need to hear from us so that they would care? What makes this really mean something to them? It started to really separate for us, what is a good investment for us versus these other things that I can get it across the line with a combination of analysis and belief. Like, let's just get really real here about who are we really trying to talk to? So,
are you trying to, like, I'm going to give you a layman's terminology of this.
Yeah.
It forced you to start cutting some of the fat, right? The things that we were doing that we didn't have to be as discerned on, and they were expected. So it was almost like a risk not to be there just because it was a part of that playbook,
right?
Not because it met first principles.
Yes.
And what you're saying is, if I have to cut, and when I add back, if I adhere to my first principles, the targeting, the personas, exactly who my ICP is, exactly what they need to know, how do I make the connection with them? That's where you're gaining the efficiencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a way to put it. And the only reason I didn't say fat maybe is because it's not necessarily fat for everyone, right? There's all these things that are cut. They do have some value. But the difference is, does it have enough value versus the cost for you when judged against your first principles, right? Because it's great for someone. It's in the bullseye for someone. It's just not in the bullseye for me. And right now we're compelled to really try to stay deeper in the bullseye.
And you said something within this about, what do they really need to know from us? What is our message, right?
Yeah.
And that is the content that you create, that you deliver. And so when you talk about first principle, how does that apply to content? And
it applies in a pretty big way. So, one of the consequences of the choices that I've made, which are not necessarily choices everyone else would, but of pulling back on certain forms of like paid media, channels, is I'm relying a lot more on content. And the way we kind of describe it, in my team is like, is it content worth consuming? Is it something worth hearing?
Yeah.
Is it worthy of someone engaging with and enjoying and learning from? Which is not always the recipe book, right? Or wasn't in the past. Sometimes it was about certain other technical factors to just get in front of people and frequency and that stuff. So we're really focused on, is this worth hearing to our audience based on first principles? What are the things they really care about? What really motivates them? We actually went and did some market research to find out, try to get our facts straight and not just go on gut. But, it enabled me in content, for example, to challenge some of the the playbook around analyst relationships, for example, which for certain target audiences are absolutely essential, but had become for everybody, for all the practicing professional modern marketers, in B2B marketing or tech marketing. It's like, oh, you have to have these certain analyst relationships, which I won't say the names, and it just sounded absurd to not have them. It's part of what you're supposed to do. That's why you have this marketing budget, and there's always this carve out for this stuff. But when I looked at our specific situation in First Principles, we found that, oh, my audience actually isn't seeking their information from that particular source in that particular situation. They're seeking it in a different way. And so what would have been, a couple years earlier, an absurd thing for me to propose, like, why don't we just sever this relationship? Now we actually have. I was able to make that decision because I was compelled, I was forced into this situation to make those kind of decisions. And I think it was actually good for us. Now, again, it doesn't mean it's not ideal and amazing and perfect for someone else, but in my specific situation, it was the right choice for us to go in a different direction.
Well, I think this is another great example of, what we talked about at the beginning, giving up as marketers what we always held dear, right? How could we give up those endless relationships, right? I want to be in the magic quadrant. I want to, these are important. I can't not do these. And those can be very fear-based decisions, right? Because what happens to the company? What happens to me if that's just a big mistake? So I love this idea of forced experimentation, back to first principles, and that it actually has yielded a real life 40% increase in efficiency. I mean, that puts the cap onto the story here, right? So what I want to do is I want to ask you, we've talked about a lot. We've talked about, the idea of this forced experimentation. We've talked about the idea of first principles. We've talked about rethinking things that we always had in our playbook. If there was, though, one thing that you wanted the audience to take away from everything we've talked about here, that's getting us thinking all in different directions, what would that be?
Well, I think it would be, I'm not trying to be like the playbook is dead guy. I'm not trying to throw that headline out there. I think what I would say is those playbooks, the frameworks, the best practices, those come together for reasons. Like, they did work for somebody, and somebody organized their thoughts, synthesized a lot of findings, and gave us these patterns that we could use to get a good start. It helps us learn. It helps inspire kind of good thinking and not reinventing the wheel. And it's still our responsibility, as the marketing professionals, the practitioners, and even as the business leaders, right? It's our responsibility to really build our own best practice, our own framework from our first principles, that because everyone else is expecting we are the ones to do that.
Yes.
So you have to do it. You can't just say anymore, well, we're doing this because it's industry standard. We're doing this because it's best practice. That really never should have been good enough. And now we're in a situation where it really isn't good enough. And so in a way, we're free to challenge those things. And it doesn't mean we're just trying to be postmodern and challenge everything that we know is right. But it is still our responsibility to go back to the ground, the ground floor. First principles, just like those of us who, those of you who went to marketing school, like, do that. Do that for your own company, so that the best practice or the framework or the whatever that you use for your company actually is fit for purpose, and doesn't depend on slack in the system, so that those imperfections that just kind of broadly apply, can be covered up when applied to your situation.
And, I don't know what your opinion on this is, but, we're also, another dynamic in all of this is that the playbook of late has been, you need to be omnichannel, right? You need to be everywhere. So that automatically tells us inside, okay, I've got to be doing more. If I'm not doing more, whether I'm adhering to first principles or not, I'm not doing my job.
Yeah.
Right. And that same, discernment that you're talking about on traditional elements of the playbook have to be applied also to all the new channels, right? And
Right.
and the omnipresence, that we need to have. But there may be very, very productive channels that we just need to double down on, right? And if we don't go omnichannel here or here, that's not going to hurt us, right? That's not where our
Yeah.
core ICP is. And just because we're hearing we need to do more, and I'm not like you're saying, I'm not knocking omnichannel in any way,
Mhm.
shape, or form. I'm just taking to another level what you're talking about here, which is we really got to take a step back. And this forced
Mhm.
experimentation has said, I was forced to take a step back. I was forced to take things out of the mix and
Mhm.
actually see what happened. And
Yeah.
then how I doled them back.
Right.
Right. So that's we're being forced to do more when sometimes doing less is going to get
Yeah.
us where we need to go.
Yeah. My take on that idea is don't accept the idea of more with less. Don't do more with less. Do fewer things really well
Yes.
that matter. Do fewer things really well that matter. Don't do more with less. That's a silly, like it's an impossible rock and a hard place for in most situations. I won't say all situations, but that's certainly not my preferred mode, is to just do more with less. And you're right, like omni-channel that's a thing. Omni-channel integrated marketing campaigns, ABM, intent, chat bots, all the things, they all have value, but you don't really know how much value relative to the cost until you've, really interrogated your first principles.
Well, this has been fantastic, Aaron. And if people have questions, follow up for you, would LinkedIn be a good, if I shared a link to your profile on LinkedIn, a good way to get a hold of
Oh
you?
yeah, that'd be great. I would love to hear from anybody.
All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you for coming on and sharing. This definitely is a unique perspective that I think the whole entire community of CMOs, we need to be scratching our head a little bit and thinking more about our first principles and maybe even experimenting a little bit with some, forced execution of things that
Right.
we should be doing and not.
Yeah.
So thank you for coming on and helping us think in a new way.
Thanks for having me.